record here. Great. So because we have a lot of questions for our panelists today, we'll get started with the event. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this GEES panel on the future of economics of education. So my name is Catherine Michaud Leclerc. I'm a PhD student from the University of Toronto, and I'll be joining Laval University as an assistant professor in this summer. So my co-host today is Cora Wigger. Cora, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Cora Wigger. I'm a PhD candidate at Northwestern, and I'm really excited to have everybody here today and get to cap off a full year of meeting as a GEES community.
Yes, so the GEES seminars, we started in March 2020 with a clear demand from grad students to build a community, to talk about research in economics of education, and just build that community of grad students. And we've had more than 30 presentations since March 2020. And we're very excited to have today our 4 panelists for the GEES panel on the future of economics of education. So we have our 4 panelists. First of all, Dr. Natalie Bau, who's an assistant professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research spans on a variety of topics in development economics and education economics, with a focus on industrial organization of educational market. We have Dr. Peter Blair, who's an assistant professor at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. He's the principal investigator of the Blair Economics Lab, a research group that studies higher education, labor market discrimination, and the link between residential segregation and educational outcomes. We have Dr. Jenifer Ruiz-Valenzuela, who is a research economist at the Center for Economics Performance at the London School of Economics. Her recent work includes studying the impact of job loss and job insecurity on child outcomes, the consequences of failing high-stakes exams, and the gender gaps in education. And finally, we have Dr. Breyon Williams, who's a researcher at Mathematica Policy Research. His current research focuses on topics related to early childhood education, preschool lunch programs, and the financial aid in higher education. So thank you so much for joining us today. Before leaving the floor to our panelists, just want to give you a brief overview of the format of our event today. So we have prepared questions that are related to 3 broad topics. So first of all, we have research questions in economics of education. Second, we have methods in economics of education. And finally, we have careers in this field. So we have selected questions after sending a poll on Twitter to make sure that the questions we ask you today are aligned with what our grad students are interested in learning about. So, so before getting into our 3 broad topics of question, I'd like to ask our 4 panelists if you can tell us about something you've been working on recently and that you're excited about and that maybe we don't know about. So I'm gonna start with Dr. Williams.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here, by the way. Something that I'm working on that you may not know about. I am currently working on a co-author paper with my advisor, Daniel Jones, who's at Pittsburgh, which is examining the impacts of partisan elections on political and education outcomes. And we're using North Carolina school board elections as the context there. So we're basically examining when those North Carolina school board elections switch from going from partisan to nonpartisan. One, like the direct impacts, does one party fare better than the other? And then we also look at, are there any policy implications as it relates to teacher turnover, student attendance, student academic outcomes? So that's like the most recent thing that I'm excited about that I'm working on.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ruiz-Valenzuela.
Hi, thank you so much for the invite. I'm very happy to be here as well. So I was thinking, like, what can I tell you that is new? And I was thinking, okay, so I'm working on this grant proposal. You know, part of my job as a researcher at the CEP is to attract external funding. So I thought like, so let me just tell you what I did yesterday. So I'm working on this grant proposal, which is trying to analyze some of the determinants to engage adults in formal education once they have quitted. And we are thinking about like 3 potential papers that are gonna focus on the role of geography, recessions, and changes in public funding. And how those 3 topics basically impact the decision of adults to re-engage in formal education.
Thank you so much. Dr. Blair?
Yeah, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to be a part of this community. Something that's top of mind for me is an idea called STARS. So we think about in this research work, individuals who don't have college degrees as being skilled through alternative routes or being STARS. We know from a lot of work, especially David Otter's work, that there's increasing labor market inequality by education. And a big part of that, we argue in our paper, comes from the fact that workers without college degrees are called unskilled workers. And so the top line in terms of what we do is we look at a worker as developing skills based on their work experience, and we can identify the skills that they have by using the OSTAR-NET database. And then we look for what are some adjacent jobs that have similar skill requirements. And then we study what are the differences in the likelihood of transitioning for jobs. How does that vary by workers with or without college degrees? The top line from this is that a lot of STARS in the US labor market are women and minorities. And we find that STARS fare worse than workers with bachelor's degrees. And we're super excited to be debuting this paper at the NBR Summer Institute. So we just found out over the weekend that this paper is accepted. So you'll be hearing more about it soon.
Thank you so much and congrats. Dr. Bau?
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to get to talk to you today. One project, so broadly, my research agenda thinks about how to improve educational outcomes in contexts where there's a lot of school choice. And so one project I've been working on is thinking about how improving the quality of public schools affects the private sector in rural Pakistan, which is a market with very a sort of high share of private schooling. And so in that project, we use a randomized control trial that gave increased funding to public schools in treated villages. You see what happens to students' outcomes, not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector. And we find that there are really substantial spillover effects where this improved spending to the public sector clouds in improvements in the private sector.
Great, thank you so much. And one thing I forgot to mention, I want to thank our GS team who's here with us today, Simon, Ahmad, Pere, Lina, and Saloni. Thank you so much for making GS happen. This has been like a great community building. So I'm leaving the floor to Cora, who will be starting our questions.
Great, thanks, Catherine, and thank you to all of our panelists. So one of the first questions that we got a lot of interest in on Twitter was about understudied topics. So I want to start this question with Drs. Blair and Dr. Williams. So what is an area of research within economics of education that you either feel has been understudied, or alternatively, just what's some new idea that's coming about now that you think is especially interesting and deserving of attention? So let's start with Dr. Blair.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is really important is trying to understand how workers learn and acquire skills. We've typically thought about this as happening primarily in educational institutions, and not just happening there, but also happening in a specific format, which is the 4 walls of education. What the pandemic has shown us is that we can provide education at scale pretty quickly, and that we can pivot pedagogy pretty rapidly. As we return to the new normal, there could be a tendency to forget a lot of the things that we've learned through COVID. But I think that there's going to be a lot of really interesting research that's going to come out saying, how can we think about using technology as a way of delivering education at scale? So I think that that's the first thing. The second thing has to do with what are some other contexts in which workers are developing skills. And so with the work that I do on workers who are STARS, we're thinking a lot about the ways in which individual places of employment could actually be a very fertile place in which workers can acquire skills that are relevant to the labor market.
Great, thank you. Dr. Williams, same question.
I think about something that's been, I don't know how new it is, but it's new to me, and it's been really interesting in the work that I've done with Mathematica, which is evidence-based procurement and education. It's something that I haven't thought about a lot, which to me, mainly defined as approaches and frameworks that can be adopted in practice that lead to, one, teachers having the tools and the products needed to enhance the teaching environment, and also students having the access to those tools and products to enhance the learning environment. And some of that might include how we think about teacher input into decision-making, whether that be at the school level, district, or even state level, and making sure that at those higher levels, state and district in particular, that they have an understanding of what are the inventory of products and tools that they're currently using, what's working, what's not working, and how best to allocate the resources given knowledge about evidence-based tools and products.
Thank you. And those seem really related too in this moment in time.
And yeah, that's what I'm thinking about. Yeah.
Great. So thinking more broadly beyond just individual topics, but about our research agendas as a whole. So all of you both do research in economics of education, but you also touch in these other areas of economics and of academia. And so how do you think about cohesively describing your research agenda? And what advice do you have for grad students and early career scholars who are working on defining and communicating their research agenda interests and future work holistically? So let's start with Dr. Bau on this one.
So I think this is a really hard question, and it's also of varying levels of importance depending on what you're planning to do after graduate school. And, you know, so I think maybe also if Dr. Williams wants to comment as well, maybe he can talk a little bit about, because I can't really talk outside of academia, he can talk a little bit about whether at Mathematica it's as important to have kind of a well-defined research agenda. So generally the advice I give my PhD students is that when you are going to write a paper, you're going to spend 4 to 5 years with that topic, if you're lucky. And so you really should be passionate about what you're doing. And so your ability to sort of strategically pick topics to create an agenda is going to be kind of limited, because if you decide I'm just going to do this thing because it fits into my agenda, but it's not actually very exciting to you, you're not going to be able to successfully write that paper. That said, when you go on the job market for an academic job, people are going to try and place, you know, who are you? Are you an education economist? Are you a labor economist? Are you a development economist? And unfortunately, that's not going to go away after the job market. When you come up for tenure again, you know, your tenure writers are going to want to write something like such and such is really the expert, and not just the expert on education economics, because it's going to be really hard for them to write such and such is the expert on education economics because Caroline Huxby is out there, right? So it's going to be easier for them if they can write things like such and such is really the expert on public procurement in education economics, or such and such is really the expert on structural models of school choice in educational economics. And so I do think it is important, both in the market and for tenure, to have a way of explaining who you are. But I think you can try and see the common themes within your research and try and explain that. And so, you know, I have work that people might sometimes think is very disconnected because some of it's on school systems and some of it's on the effects of cultural traditions, but almost all of it's on human capital investment. That's the common theme. And so I'm really working on understanding how to increase people's human capital in vulnerable situations, right? And so you just have to sort of understand what's the common theme that's emerging in your work and how can you explain that to other people. And, you know, luckily for the job market, you get to do that in interviews and in your cover letter. And when you know, many, many years from now, when you go up for tenure, you get to do that through your research statement. So you have kind of an opportunity to craft that. And that's something, you know, your mentors will also give you feedback on. So I know that was a very long answer, so I'll stop there.
That was great. I'll turn it over to Dr. Ruiz-Valenzuela. Same question about communicating a research agenda.
Thank you, Natalie. I learned so much from your answer. I was like, when I read the question, I thought like, wow, it's a bit difficult. You know, I have forgotten how to describe my research agenda in a way that I sell myself. So I was going back, okay, so I was going back to check the CEP website and say, okay, what do we say that it's our goal? And this will inform me about like, how do I describe my research agenda? And so basically, I mean, that was very helpful because I mean, I found like what is common about basically all my papers, you know, like one of the main goals of the Center for Economic Performance at LSE is that we do research that informs public policy. So within my area, which is education and skills, most of my papers try to provide some evidence on how different aspects of the education system, mainly in England, but also elsewhere, can shape student outcomes and progression. So that's, that is how I would define my my broad research area and my research agenda, so topics that fit in there. Now, when it comes to advice, I was thinking about it, and I came to something quite similar to what Natalie was saying. When I finished the PhD and I first entered the CEP, something I was told is that I was better off concentrating in a given area rather than try to specialize in several different areas, because there are returns, I think there are returns to a specialization, and there are also entry costs in each field. Like you want to go to workshops that are specialized and conferences so that you get to meet who are going to be your potential referees, etc. So I think that was a very good advice that I have pretty much followed, and only now, like 7 years away from the PhD, I start engaging in things that are not strictly economics of education, but I never do it alone. Like I always, I work with co-authors that might have some overlapping interests, and then it naturally comes, but I never invest by myself in a new complete, in a new topic, let's say.
It's really interesting, especially on the co-authors and how you kind of expand in that way. Any follow-ups, or would anyone like to respond to anything the other panelists have said?
I just want to say that brilliant advice on both ends. The whole idea of thinking about topically, what are you interested in, and framing it more so around that, and thinking about the different fields of economics is providing you with the tools and the frameworks to answer that question. So this is Natalie's point, and Jen's point about the importance of co-authoring with people and using that as a way to lower the barriers to entry. I think that both excellent points. So just want to underline, underscore, ditto them.
Thank you. I will turn it over to Catherine now to get into methods.
Yeah, so now we'll talk about methods in economics of education. And one question that gathered quite a lot of interest from grad students was to think about, what do you think is the role of structural models in economics of education? And what do you think is the trade-off with more reduced form work? So I'm gonna ask Dr. Bau, if you can tell us what you think about it.
Okay, so again, a pretty tough question. So my view in general is that what matters is the question, not the methods, and that you should select the methods that are appropriate to the question that you want to answer. And so I have work that uses LCTs. I also have work that builds big equilibrium models and estimates them. And that's really just a matter of the question that I'm trying to answer in that work. If you want to, so just to kind of give you guys, I wouldn't say this is the checklist, but if you want to be able to estimate, like a primitive and a production function, or if you want to be able to run a counterfactual about saying what's the equilibrium effects of something if we change something about the world, you're probably going to need to do some kind of structural estimation. If you don't want to do something that requires a model, then it may not make sense to do structural estimation. I think sometimes people get tempted to do structural estimation just to show off that they're smart and they know how to do it, especially on the job market. And a lot of time, that ends up getting taken out of the final papers when they get published. My one advice for people who are thinking about doing structural estimation is that I think a lot of people realize they're interested in questions that require structural estimation too late, after they've taken their graduate school PhD courses. And the barriers to entry for structural estimation are pretty high. So for those of you who are in, your first or second year, and you're thinking, I might be interested in doing this style of work, I would think about taking the industrial organization sequence at your university, because usually, depending on the university, usually they don't teach a lot of structural methods in the other applied sequences.
Thank you so much. That's really great advice. Dr. Blair, would you like to tell us what you think about structural versus reduced form work?
I just want to sit here and just take notes of what everybody else is saying. But this is really rich. I'll zoom out a little bit. I completely agree with Natalie that it really should be a lot about the question. And you should think about yourself as, Esther Duflo talks about the economist as a plumber. And you should think about yourself as having a bunch of tools, right? So, you might need sorry, let me dial back a little bit. So I have papers that started off with just descriptive statistics, and then I have other papers that are completely structural. And so my approach would be to say, number one, think about what is your comparative advantage. There might be certain ways in which you typically think about a problem. So I came to economics from being in a PhD program in theoretical physics. And so I always would think about what is the underlying model first. And over time, I've become a lot more interested in thinking more about what are the descriptive statistics? What's the phenomena about the world that I want to describe? And then can I describe it using a reduced form procedure, or can I describe it using a structural model? I think that really taking the question as the primitive and then thinking about what are the right tools to answer it. I'll make one other quick push for doing descriptive work, which is if you look at a lot of the really foundational work on inequality, whether it's, Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman, or you think about a lot of the work coming out of Opportunity Insights with Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren and Jonathan Friedman. A lot of that work starts from documenting some really striking facts about the world. And I hope that, for many of you in the audience here, that you don't run away from just trying to understand some puzzles in the world as a first step for motivating what sorts of models we should think about.
Thank you so much. That's really great advice. And maybe for our future GEES presenters who will be presenting their work, that's something to keep in mind for their presentation. So our next question is thinking about having access to data and thinking about RCTs. So access to good data is a common challenge that grad students face, especially for grad students who may have more limited resources and grad students who are interested in conducting RCT. So what advice do you have for students in econ of education to find good data? And how do you think it is important to develop partnership with organizations or faculty members to design RCTs? So Dr. Ruiz-Valenzuela, would you like to answer the question?
Yeah, great question. And I have some experience on successful and not so successful attempts at getting good data. So I wanted to start first with advice in general about finding good data outside of RCTs, because many times you might have a very good question in mind and you know that the data is out there, but it's just not available for researchers. But there is an institution out there that has the data. So it is possible, if you know people that might know these other people at institutions, it is worth, knocking on doors and chasing to get that data, but always with something in mind for graduate students. This process can take a very long time. So it might be something for just later on, right? I just want to give you a very quick example. When I started working at the CEP, we were interested in this question, which was what's the impact of failing to get a good grade in the high stakes exams in England at age 16 for later educational outcomes and progression. And we knew that the data on the marks on that exam existed, but it was just not available in administrative data sets. But those organizations that were marking the exams, the awarding bodies, for sure had the data, and there had to be a way to get that data and merge it. So I started writing every possible organization that is marking exams, and I finally get one positive answer, and then I convinced the people at the Department for Education to link that data to the admin data set. But my point here is that it took me 3 years from the moment I started until I got all the data, and then you have to put several more years until you write the paper, you present it in conferences, you send it for the first time, it's rejected, you send it again. So it is a very long process. So that's on general data advice. Now for RCTs, I think I'm gonna let Natalie talk about this, but just a very quick thing is, in my experience, the implementation of RCTs without a good and knowledgeable infrastructure behind that supports you and helps you dealing with many risks involved with RCTs, how do you control potential attrition and contamination and all these things. Without that infrastructure, you are bound to have an RCT that is not going to deliver good results to be able to publish it later.
Thank you, Dr. Bau. Do you want to address this RCT point and also access to good data?
Okay, so in terms of all CTs, I think as a PhD student, you should enter with trepidation. So that doesn't mean that you shouldn't necessarily do an LCT for your job market paper, but I think as Dr. Ruiz-Valenzuela was pointing out, the chances of failure can be high. Things come up. Someone in my PhD once had an really promising LCT ready to go in Liberia, and then for her job market paper, and then the Ebola epidemic hit, and she basically had to suspend it, for about 4 years. And so I think if you're going to pursue an LCT as a PhD student, you should definitely have backup options that you're thinking about. I think, as has been pointed out, it's also helpful to be working in an existing infrastructure. So many of you may have advisors who are already doing LCTs in different contexts. They may have organizations they work with. And so it might be a lot easier for you to, sort of piggyback a project along with the work they're doing than for you to set up a full new LCT. Obviously people do set up full new LCTs. I don't want to say they don't, but I think that would be a good way to decrease the barriers to entry as a PhD student, especially because LCTs often require a lot of financial resources. And many of you may not have access to those kinds of financial resources at your institutions. In terms of accessing data, there are now sort of, 3 or 4 kind of main administrative data sets people use in the US. You've probably seen them in a lot of different papers, Texas, North Carolina. I think if you decide that's the route you want to go, you should figure out a research agenda that you can do with that data. You shouldn't be applying for Texas data for one paper, North Carolina data for another paper, and California data for a third paper, because all of these data sets are going to be, cumbersome to access. Even the ones where there's kind of like a well-defined process, you need to write a proposal, they need to review it, it's going to take many months. And they're going to have high fixed costs to learn how to use. So I think if you're thinking, oh, I really would like to write a paper with the Texas administrative data, for example, you should really think about what is a research agenda that I could work on. How could I write 3 papers for my dissertation with the Texas administrative data? Because all of these, any new data set you access is going to come with incredible fixed costs, and it's also going to allow you to specialize in something that people, don't have a lot of information about. Okay, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I'll leave the floor to Cora to continue with methods questions.
So I think this next question actually links into a lot of what Dr. Bau and Dr. Blair were saying of matching methods to your questions, but also having to balance preparation and make sure you have the tools. And so I want to start with Dr. Williams on this one. What's some kind of underrated empirical tool, method, or even a practice that you either wish you'd invested in learning earlier, or you wish others would spend more time learning? And so both thinking about your research and the questions that you generate, but also your experience at Mathematica and seeing what kinds of projects come in and what tools are useful in that setting.
Sure. Just on the last topic, I can just say I used a lot of administrative data on my PhD papers, and I would argue persistence was probably one of the most important things that allowed me to get that data. For one paper in particular, I got administrative data from the state government, and one big reason for my being able to get that data was just offering one to come in, and if it was allowed to like run the code myself, depending on like how the data was stored. Sometimes it's just they don't have the staff, or they have to prioritize other things. So it's just sometimes it's just a issue of having a programmer to actually pull that data. So it may not always be the case that they'll allow you to do it, but it's worth asking. And another time it was just consistently like following up with the data people to get the data. So just a tidbit. I was really it was persistence that like won me those 2 data sets. On your question about methods, practices, one thing that comes to mind for me, and I'm not sure if this is more for those that write policy-oriented papers, but design and implementation research was something that I was not very privy to coming out of my PhD. I may have done aspects of it while I was writing my paper and I realized I was doing it. But I found that particularly in the work that we do at Mathematica, those two phases are just as important as, let's say, impact evaluation for various reasons. One, I think having some knowledge about whether it's a policy or program, what was the intention, how well designed or how well constructed was the policy or the program, and then conditional on that, particularly for programs, what was the rollout like implementation, how well was it rolled out, will give you a lot of context behind when you actually go to estimate impacts, to give you some sense of whether, the results are what they should be, given what you know about how well ran the program was, or whether perhaps you're seeing results maybe because of some issues related to implementation. I would argue that those would be very important phases to at least have some high level knowledge of that they do exist. And there's a lot of great opportunities in and of themselves to get creative with your research papers, to make sure you have a great framing of your research paper and maybe give you some new ideas for existing research papers.
That's great. I want to follow up on that just a little bit. Could you say a little more about what kinds of practices you engage in order to understand how the rollout went, or what kinds of issues might have come up, or understand the context?
Yeah. So mainly so for example, there's a project that I'm working on with the Gates Foundation where they're looking to scale up virtual tutoring programs. Like tutoring is a big deal now in light of COVID. So they're working with several grantees, mostly nonprofits. Each of them have like their own unique take on how to provide virtual tutoring to students, particularly in the middle years, grades 3 through grades 8. So some of the things and a lot of it can be very simple, but some of the things they focus on is just how well trained were the tutors, for example. Were the tutors aware of the curriculum that was taught in the classroom? To what degree was there variation in terms of awareness of the curriculum across tutors? What about the tutor-student relationship? Did students feel engaged? Did they feel a sense of belonging? What about attendance? Attendance is a big deal. So, if you start, which is kind of where coming out of my grad program where I was, where let's say you have a virtual tutoring program and you have some exogenous variation and then you test it and then you see there's no impacts, and I'd be very quick to say, oh, so this doesn't work. Not taking into account, well, perhaps that could be because, the students and the tutors didn't really mesh well. Maybe the relationship wasn't there. Maybe students weren't engaged for some other reason. Perhaps the content wasn't culturally responsive enough. So it's, just kind of more so thinking about all of these elements that you would hope ultimately lead to students participating, and then conditional on participating, really being engaged and understanding like what the goal is for them.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Blair, similar related question of, are there particular tools, practices, methods that you think are worth spending the time investing in early?
Yeah, I'm super excited to answer this question. As some of you may know, I run a research group, and so I love mentoring PhD students. And what happens is when you're doing this at scale, you have to think a lot about processes to implement. I'll dial back a little bit and just touch briefly on the data question. Some of the earliest papers that I wrote were all using public use data. And that was because as a young assistant professor, I didn't have a lot of money. And that was really a blessing insofar as I had to think really creatively about what are some new insights that I can glean from existing data sets. So for example, the work that I did on occupational licensing, where we show that licensing reduces racial and gender wage gaps, this is a super old question. And at the time that we started working on licensing, a lot of people thought licensing is a dead field. There's nothing new to know. it's a restriction on supply, it increases prices, no benefit to consumers, but we were able to glean a different insight because we were thinking theoretically. And so even in public use data sets, I think that there are a lot of key insights that you can glean, and sometimes not having resources makes you a bit more resourceful. And so don't underestimate the power of asking really sharp questions. In terms of infrastructure to invest in, I'll tell you something that I think our group does well, and then something that I think I wish I'd done better when I was a graduate student. One thing that I would suggest is the moment that you start to write a paper, to think about a paper, open up an account in Overleaf and start writing the paper. And so I have a template in Overleaf where whenever I start a project, I open up that project template, I copy it, I rename it, why don't elite colleges expand supply? I share it with my co-authors. And in there, we have a template for the slides, for the paper, for the abstract. And I start writing as I'm doing the paper. So once I do the data analysis, once I clean the data, I start writing the description of the data. And I continue to iterate because writing is a muscle. And if you wait until the paper is done to start writing, you would have forgotten some of the things that you thought you should have put in. In terms of something that is an important tool to invest in that I wish I had invested in more earlier, is thinking very clearly about developing your skills as a coder. Oftentimes in economics, we don't teach people how to code. They just learn from a graduate student that's a year above them, or they learn through doing an RA process. Take a proper course on coding, or look at the toolkit that Matt Genskow put together in terms of how do you store your data? How do you do version control with GitHub? How do you make sure that what you're doing is reproducible? How do you make sure that you comment it properly so that when your future self looks at it, your future self is loving your present self? I think that that is incredibly important. And related to that, to invest in learning how to write. I had one of my advisors in graduate school says, you need to improve your writing. And this particular advisor, his first language was not English. And so I had to eat a lot of humble pie. And I said, yes, sir. And I went and I took a writing class in graduate school and learned how to write introductions and abstracts and just fall in love with writing. Because if you are able to communicate your ideas very clearly and persuasively, think about it as a Cobb-Douglas production function, and one is the quality of the work itself, the quality of the data, and the quality of the writing. If the quality of the writing is zero, you can have an RCT with incredible data, everything could be amazing, but your ideas aren't communicated clearly. On the other hand, you can have an idea that's really great, you can have data that's okay, and you can write incredibly well, and people can be very enamored with the work that you're doing because it's very clearly presented and articulated.
Wonderful. And as somebody who was raised by a professor who teaches writing, I'm loving that answer. And he'd be telling me that this is what he's been telling me my whole life too. Is now what the economists are telling me too. So I want to give a second if there's any other comments on this methods topic before we move on to careers.
I'll say one other quick thing, machine learning. It's totally the rage. There is going to be an NBR workshop for graduate students in September on machine learning. It was on Twitter somewhere. Please sign up for it if that is something that you're interested in. This is, yeah, I think this is going to be a tool for the future.
That's great. Thank you. I didn't know about that. We'll find that and link it on our G's website. Okay, so moving on to careers, which is, I think, what probably at least half the group is sitting here waiting for us to just start talking about, advice for job market and all of that. But I think our big question I want to make sure we get to is just to ask a couple of you, and I'm going to start with Dr. Ruiz-Valenzuela here, to tell us a bit more about your professional position. And you already got into this a little bit with talking about this grant and sort of what your responsibilities look like, and then how that position helps you achieve your professional and research goals.
Thank you. So I am not faculty at LSE like Natalie or Peter are. I am a researcher at a research center, at a research center at LSE, and that implies several things. So I am not, what does not imply is teaching. I don't teach. So most of my time is spent on doing research, which has to be, as I said, usually policy relevant research with, but always with a purpose that what we do, even if we start with some descriptive research to inform us about whatever topic that we're interested in, then the ultimate goal is that we can produce something that can be published well in journals. So that's a big part of my job. I do research, but then a very big part is also dissemination and knowledge transfer. So I present, we are very much communicating with the Department for Education. So I've been invited several times to present findings of results in the Department for Education, at what is the Association of Colleges here in the UK, or the British Council, etc. So I engage a lot with policymakers and people, other researchers that work in think tanks and educational charities, for instance. Then another part of my job is, of course, like try to come up with new ideas to get this external funding. So that is basically what my role involves, as well as representing the institution in events and stuff. But so how does this help to accomplish my goals? So okay, so what are my goals? When I finished the PhD about like 7 years ago, I didn't know whether I wanted to stay in academia or not at that point. So at that point, I was, while finishing the PhD, I was at the same time working at the OECD. So I could just have stayed there. But if I was thinking, if I stay here now, I am most likely closing my doors to go back to academia. So at that point, going to the LSE, to this position, seemed like a good balance professionally to keep on doing what I wanted to do, which was research in education, potentially policy oriented. So that has worked pretty well for me. But for those of you that are considering options like that, I just want to highlight that there are, like, if you want to go back to academia, I mean, there are costs of this option, because it buys you some time, but you cannot forget that you need to publish, and you need to publish well, because at the end of the day, you'll have to compete with those fresh PhD students going out on the market, and you're gonna just have to show more because you have been several years out of the PhD. And so you cannot forget, even if you're working, like, let's say, in an institution that is very related and you're doing academic work, don't forget that, you know, you need to publish if you really then want to jump to a type assistant professor position, and that it is costly. You're going to have a lot of competition from fresh PhD students.
Thank you for that. I want to turn the same question over to Dr. Williams. So can you describe a little bit more about your professional position and how that helps you with your professional and research goals?
Sure. So I'm a researcher at Mathematica, and I focus mostly on projects, or exclusively, I would say, on projects in education. So coming out of my PhD program, I don't think that I had a very specific research agenda in terms of, like, I wanted to work on this particular topic within Econ of Ed. You know, most education topics I find very interesting. So that was one reason for why I thought this was a perfect fit for me, because there's a lot of variation in the project work at Mathematica. For example, there's projects that do focus on design research. There's projects that focus on implementation research, and there are projects that focus on impact evaluation. And then there's some that probably had focused on a combination of the three. And also there's going to be variation in terms of the areas. For example, as I mentioned earlier, one project that I'm working on centers around the development of an evidence-based virtual tutoring program. Whereas there are other projects that might focus more so on, you know, teacher quality and impacts on education. So the topic areas very much so vary. And for the most part, I think as a researcher, you have flexibility in terms of what type of projects you want to get on. Not all of them are like quant heavy, obviously. There's some that are, you know, more qualitative. We do a lot of work for foundations, helping them to kind of summarize the work that they've done in the education space in terms of the investments they make, formulating narratives, thinking about next steps. So there's a good bit of different types of tasks you can do within education. And is essentially sums up what I do. And what I also like about my position is the fact that I get an opportunity not just to collaborate with researchers, but also with practitioners and other folks in the communities that have some stake in the policies or programs that are on the ground right now.
Great, thank you all. So Dr. Blair and Dr. Bau, I didn't start with you because I think most of us have a better understanding of what faculty positions are like, but I'd still like to hear if either of you want to add in how those positions help you with your professional and research goals specific to you.
Peter, do you want to start? Or?
You can go, Natalie.
Okay. I was hoping to make you answer. Also, maybe I can answer Solani's question in the chat a little bit longer, because I suspect it's a question that a lot of people had. For those of you who didn't read the chat, Solani asked basically about when in the PhD you decide whether to go into academia versus non-academic jobs. When is ideal to make that choice and so on. So maybe I can say, I wrote a little bit in the chat, but maybe I can say a couple words on that, because I know that's something PhD students often ask me about. So in terms of academic jobs, as probably most of you know, if you look at, a research-oriented university, the vast majority of your time is going to be devoted to research. And you're a little bit like a small business. So I think it's a little bit different from a lot of private sector NGO jobs where you're a little bit like a small business owner. Because basically, most of the time, people leave you on your own, unless, you're dealing with your employees. Like in Peter's case, he actually has essentially employees, PhD students, but, and you just work on what you think is important. And you actually, you're kind of the residual claimant on all the shocks that hit you, because let's go determine whether you get raises or whether you get tenure is going to be, how well your papers publish and, your ability to get grants and things like that. So I think it comes with basically a lot of the same pros and cons of being a small business owner. You have tremendous freedom to work on what you want to work on, but you have to think about what the market wants. If you work on things the market doesn't want, in the long run, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting tenure because you're not going to be able to publish. So I think academia can be great, comes with huge amounts of freedom. Good research institutes, are reasonably well resourced. But I'll tell you that if you are a UCLA type place, you're not going to have the same kinds of resources that maybe your advisors at Harvard or Northwestern have. And so I think this was also a bit of an adjustment for PhD students, because a lot of times they see the resources their advisors have, and they sort of expect that they're going to have similar similar resources when they become professors. But actually, as an assistant professor, often not, at a top 10 institution, you're probably not going to have those kinds of resources. But, as a small business owner, you're going to have to think about how to use the resources that you have in kind of the optimal way. So that's what I would say is kind of like what's unique about this job, and allows us to pursue our research goals in the sense that we just have incredible freedom to do what we want to do within the limits that we have to respond to market forces. In this case, the market forces being, the editors of the journals. Just really briefly on Solani's question, I don't want to go on too long. I think if you think you might want to get an academic job, you have to act like you're going into academia for your entire PhD, because there's no way you're going to be competitive. The academic job market is very competitive. And so if you don't set out to write a very good job market paper, there's no way you're going to be kind of competitive when you go onto the academic job market. So if you think academia is something you want to do, I think you kind of just have to act like you're going into academia, even if in the long run you don't. Now, some people realize pretty early that academia is not what they want to do, and they're pretty sure about that. Then maybe you shouldn't spend 6 years in the PhD. I had classmates who, realized pretty early that they wanted to go into consulting or something like that. They didn't want to go into a research position, and they graduated in 4 years, and didn't go on the academic job market at all. So I think if you really realize, okay, I definitely don't want to do academia. Not only do I not want like a job as a professor, but I don't want a research-oriented job, which is sort of the same job market. then you might want to think about how can you do your PhD more quickly so you can go into kind of a non-research oriented job. I think what people do is they simultaneously go in the academic and non-academic job market. A lot of non-academic jobs still interview at the AEA. I would guess Mathematica interviews at the AEA. Amazon interviews at the AEA. So it's sort of a huge range of non-academic jobs will interview at the AEA. And so you can do that market simultaneously and make a choice. Once you see your choice set, kind of make a choice about what you want to do. The last thing I'll say, which I mentioned in the chat, and which I think has kind of already been said as well, is that it's much easier to go from an academic job to a non-academic job than vice versa. So, a lot of time people have a choice and they'll say, well, this job at Amazon looks great, this job at, this university looks great, but I'm going to take the university job because I know I could always go to Amazon. But if I go to Amazon, it's going to be really hard for me to go back and get a university job, because essentially if you're working 40, 50 hours a week somewhere, you're not going to be publishing a ton of papers. And it's going to be really hard for you to be competitive for getting an academic job. So I'll stop there with that long-winded answer.
Can I just add something? I mean, I agree with that. I also agree with Peter's point, maximizing your choice set. So to the extent possible, I think you just want to not focus too much while you're a PhD student on whether I want to go into academia or not. I think you should just focus on, being the best graduate student you can, getting the best papers out and graduating, and then going on the job market and seeing what options are available for you. And then you're going to have to make a decision based off of that choice set.
I would just add that this is your life. Enjoy it. You're going to be in graduate school for 5 years. Enjoy every moment of it. There are things about graduate school that suck. There are also things that are awesome, right? Something that sucks is there are times when you just feel completely lost and you feel directionless. But at the same time, you have 5 or 6 years to just think about one project. When you become a faculty member, it's just there's so many different things happening. You have your research, you have your students' research, supervise, you have to teach, referee reports, conferences, people emailing you to ask you to do stuff, committee service, like just and when I have a day where I could have 4 hours uninterrupted just to sit and think about one project, not 2 projects, one project, it just feels so delicious and I just enjoy it so much. So enjoy that aspect about graduate school. On the other hand, being a faculty member is awesome, right? Like you earn more money than you do in graduate school. You have freedom over your time. You don't have to take any test. You get an office. So being a professor is really awesome. I just was talking with one of my students who's now a professor, and he just was saying, yeah, Peter, this is really awesome. He's like, I used to hate tests when I was in graduate school, but now when I give tests, I can just show up and I can do work while I'm giving a test. So in both stages of life, it is your life. You should enjoy what you're doing and try to find the things about that experience that's distinctive that you enjoy and just lean into it and press into it very much.
Thank you so much to the 4 of you. This is all really great advice. So we are a bit short for our Q&A session, but we know that you've been answering the questions of our participants who messaged us in the chat. There's maybe one question. Some of our GEES participants are undergrad students who are doing their master. So maybe a quick note on what do you think for students who are thinking about starting a PhD, what do you think are the trade-offs with ed school, econ programs versus policy schools? So if one of you want to answer that question. Maybe Dr. Bau, I know you've talked about this on Twitter before, so maybe you want to say something.
Okay, and I think actually maybe Peter should say something because I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about education, PhD programs as well. And Peter, I know you have an association with the ed school at Harvard, so I think Paul, you can say something much more informative than anything I can say. So I think broadly, so what I've talked about on Twitter is public policy PhDs that are like shadow economics PhDs. And so I would say broadly, there's a lot of, if you're interested in kind of what I'll call applied economics, which means, kind of applied micro topics, there's a lot of different PhD programs that could be a good fit for you. Some of those programs might be, just standard economics programs. Obviously, they'll give you a good training in applied micro. Also, those might be in public policy schools like the Harvard Kennedy School or the Chicago Harris. They have excellent in-house economics faculty. They place graduates in good economics jobs. Famously, David Otto is a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School Public Policy PhD. And they basically give pretty much as good applied micro training as an economics PhD. I won't go into a ton of detail because I have a Twitter thread online. But I think it's worth thinking about those, and also, depending on your interests, PhD programs that maybe don't have economics in the title, but are still going to let you answer those sets of questions, like education PhDs. I think people often get too hung up on having to go to the Harvard MIT PhD in economics. I see a lot of stress on Twitter, like people kind of like stressed out about the impossibility of getting into these programs. But many people who go on to be, very successful researchers don't go to these programs. Like they go to programs that specialize in their interests and give them great training. But I would guess if you want to do education, that Harvard Ed School would give you a great training, maybe better than that economics program, right? Because they're going to specialize in that interest. So I think it's worth thinking about PhD programs outside of economics, but that have, especially to have a quantitative focus. I think you do have to be a bit careful because you want, depending on what you want to do, if you want to get a job in an economics department later on, you should probably look at programs that can place people in economics departments. And so, obviously Harvard Kennedy School can do that. But that's going to range from different programs. And so I think it just means you need to do a little bit more research to understand the strengths of different programs. Okay, I'll stop talking now.
Yeah, I'll just say very briefly, definitely apply to the Harvard Ed School. We're going to be accepting applications in the fall, so a plug there. One quick thing about being in an ed school that I think is really awesome is you're an economist and you get trained in the same way that other economists get trained. So our students take classes in the ed school. They also take classes at, at the Harvard Economics Department. Some of them take classes at MIT, at the Kennedy School. And so when you go to an ed school, you're getting the resources of the ed school plus all of the other schools too. So you kind of get the best of all worlds. In addition to that, I think what I've enjoyed a lot about being in this space is I get to see education from the lens of not just an economist, but some of my colleagues are historians, or sociologists, or psychologists, or psychometricians. And it has enriched my perspective about education. It can be a very generative space too for thinking about new sorts of insights. Some of the leaders in terms of thinking about socio-emotional skills are at ed schools, right? When we think about some of the kind of like the core things that deal with theories of learning, economists aren't specialists there. But if you have an advisor who's a developmental psychologist and one who's an economist, there's a complementarity that you can do as well. So if you're someone that really wants to live at the intersection of disciplines and write papers for, say, a journal like Science, more so than writing for like a top 5 journal, you can write those sorts of papers if you're in a space where there is this kind of interdisciplinary training.
Great, thank you all so much. We are really out of time, but I still want to offer, if anyone just wants to jump in, our last question, you don't all have to answer it, was just what's one piece of advice you got as a grad student that was especially useful to you? And if anyone wants to take an extra second and jump in on that, I'd love to hear it.
I think Natalie mentioned it earlier, which is work on topics that you're passionate about, because if you don't, it's going to be really hard to make progress during the difficult times.
This piece of advice was from my mom. She was like, get out of graduate school. The point of getting in is to get out. I know that there's a tendency to like push and to get 6 and 7 and it goes more and more. But there was one point when I was thinking about getting a 6th year. And my mom said, no, Peter. She said, go on the job market, get a job, and they will graduate you.
Just something else of like getting out of things. One of the things that I was told just after graduating is put your papers on an editor's desk. Don't leave it in your desk for like 5 years because they are not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add to what's already been said. Work on what you like, have fun, I think we all complain a lot about academia, but there's not many jobs where you get to do whatever you want and get paid really well for it. So I think, as Peter said, you should really try and enjoy it.
Thank you all. All of that advice went straight to my heart. So I really appreciate it. We're going to close up. Before we go, I'm going to unpin everybody and we'll take kind of a group screenshot picture. So anyone who's comfortable putting their video on and getting a picture, that'd be great. One last note, final thank you to the other G's organizers, Saloni, Simon, Lena, Pere, and Ahmed. And to all of the community that has allowed us to keep doing this. We never intended for this to keep going for this long, but it has just continued to be such a generative, great space of connecting people from so many different areas of economics of education. And as of right now, we are planning to do a 4th round. Look out for the request for abstracts this summer. I think we talked about doing those June or July. So we will be in touch with all of you very soon. So thank you all. I'm gonna remove these spotlights and we'll take a picture.
I'm taking screenshots, but I can't take everyone, so
I'll have to do a couple.
Great. So thank you so much, and thank you, Cora, to co-host this event with me. This was really great, and thank you to our panelists for your time and really helpful advice to all of us. So big thank you to all.
Thanks for having us here.
Thank you all.